Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. We have a ton of stuff to get through in today's video. I want to begin though with Intel's Rocket Lake. Rocket Lake has been a very mysterious processor because while we have an understanding that its architecture isn't Skylake, even some of my better sources at Intel, quite frankly, are kind of mystified exactly what Rocket Lake actually is, and it seems to be a popular thing throughout the industry that no one's 100% certain how Rocket Lake performs. I'm hearing everything from, in gaming performance, it's not quite as good as Zen 3, to, yes, it's actually better than Zen 3 in gaming performance, but simply because Zen 3 with the 5950X, for example, will have more processor cores. It probably will win in something that's highly multi-threaded, let's say like, I don't know, Blender work or whatever. Anyway, Rocket Lake S for the longest time has been assumed to launch late this year, so that's 2020 if you're watching this in a far-flung future, or possibly very early next year, so around January was kind of expected. But this does not look to be the case. Videocards.com actually have an article on this. I'll link it, of course, in the video description. And they are actually claiming that we could be seeing these processors in as late as March next year. So the good thing about Rocket Lake, for folks who bought an LGA 1200 motherboard, so Z490 for example, is that they are basically pin compatible with that motherboard, assuming the vendor, which I'm assuming more reputable vendors such as Asus or whomever, will provide BIOS updates. Furthermore, there are actually literal statements in motherboard manuals, I've covered these before, that you will be able to run the future processor with PCIe Gen 4. I even showed a couple of photos of my own manuals which do state this from my review samples. So obviously that's definitely good for future proofing. However, Intel will also be launching their own 500 series motherboards, and this will of course be Z590, B560, so on and so on. Allegedly the motherboard manufacturers already have the spec sheet for this, which isn't really surprising given how long it takes for bring up and testing, but there are apparently some changes. So this does include improvements to overclocking support, for example memory overclocking support. Now personally, as a slight aside, I would love it if Intel simplified their SKU lineup and basically had it so that all processors, other than perhaps the lowest end ones, were overclockable, multiplier unlocked, more in line with what we're seeing with AMD. I think that would be absolutely spiffy, and I would personally like that, just a more simplified lineup, but whether we're going to get that or no, who the hell knows. The one thing, as I was alluding to earlier though, is that Rocket Lake apparently only goes up to 8 cores, 16 threads, which is obviously smaller than 10 cores, 20 threads of the 10900K. This is possibly not a big deal when it comes to gaming for a couple of reasons. One, I am hearing rumours that the clock frequency of Rocket Lake is actually higher than Comet Lake. I personally will believe that when I see it, but those are the rumours. The second is that the architecture is significantly more advanced, so it does more work. Again, I don't know how it will compete with Zen 3. I suspect it will fairly well in gaming, although one of my exclusives was that internally AMD are saying that Intel will be needing to, quote, pop pain pills when they actually figure out the gaming performance, and this does match up very well by what we're hearing at this point for the Ryzen 5000. We will, of course, be learning a lot more about Ryzen 5000 in the next few days, so I will be doing extensive coverage of that, but obviously AMD are most likely referring to Comet Lake, and Rocket Lake is not the same architecture. Speaking, by the way, of architectures though, let's mosey our way down the road to Alder Lake S. Alder Lake is the successor to Rocket Lake, there's so many lakes, and it is the 12th generation processors. This is also a pretty big departure for Intel for several billion reasons. The first is that it features a radically different approach. It actually has a big/small design. If that sounds at all familiar, yes, it's a bit like ARM big/little, or big.LITTLE to be precise. And the big cores are Golden Cove and Gracemont brings up the smaller rear. Golden Cove is, from what I understand, a pretty big, pretty sizable leap in IPC, so I do believe it's possible that Alder Lake could actually fare pretty well against AMD, but of course the asterisk there is, well, that's A, according to, well, depending on what AMD will have on the market at that point, and B, how high Intel managed to crank the clocks up for this damn thing. Alder Lake, though, has a few leaks. The first is that Notebook Check recently published an exclusive, I'll link it in the description of the video, and according to their exclusive, it supports both DDR5 and PCIe Gen 5, put a kind of dot on the DDR5 support, we'll get into that in just a second. PCIe 5 is not something that AMD have confirmed, but it's not difficult to imagine that by, let's say, late 2021, 2022, AMD's offerings will indeed support DDR5, as that's what is going to become pretty normal on the market at that point, and I suspect that it's not going to happen with the Zen 3 refresh, which again is apparently going to be still using the AM4 socket, possibly. There is some, let's say, debate on that one. I'm hearing from some people it's still AM4, and other people are saying it's not AM4. But either way, the bottom line is that the refresh is definitely very unlikely to be using DDR5 memory, but as always, so much conflicting information, we can only wait for official confirmation either way. But switching back to Alder Lake, it does indeed support DDR5 as well as PCIe Gen 5, but there is a bit of conflicting information because of results on Sysoft Sandra. Now, these admittedly are very early results. The clock frequency here is a paltry 1.4 gigahertz. So that would have been like, well, let's say a very, very early engineering sample CPU, to put it mildly. It does, however, still have 16 cores, 32 threads detected, and the cache amount also matches up with what we expect. 1.25 megabytes of level 2 cache times 10 and 30 megabytes of level 3 cache. But it also does state DDR4. There are several ways you could take that. One is that it's just Sysoft Sandra saying, what's going on, help me, I don't understand, okay, DDR4 it is. Or possibly these are early engineering samples which are designed not necessarily for desktop, or maybe they are designed for desktop, but maybe the DDR4 and DDR5 support is something that the CPUs can do. Maybe it can support both. Who the hell knows? Either way, we do believe it does support DDR5, but it seems that at least some variants of it will support DDR4. And switching from Intel, let's move over to Microsoft. The first is that Wolfenstein, Dishonored, and Prey collections seem to be receiving Xbox Series X/S ports, courtesy of IGN, by the way, for this. ESRB pages for the aforementioned games have actually emerged. Now, if you think about it, this logically does make sense, because it wouldn't take a huge amount of work, given the PC variants of these titles, let's say for Wolfenstein or whatever, to add in things like hardware-based ray tracing, higher resolution, and maybe other bits and pieces for a remaster, better textures and other things. Again, a lot of that stuff could probably be ported over from PC assets as well, depending upon the game. And given that Microsoft have just coughed up, just a paltry $7.5 billion US, it's not very difficult to assume that they would want to maximize the titles that they can actually release on the next-gen consoles. Again, I do understand that the experiences are probably going to be something that you've already played through, so if you've played through Wolfenstein at the end of the day, there's probably not going to be that much difference for the Xbox Series X version, but I think it is pretty cool that Microsoft are doing this, assuming, of course, that they do a reasonable job of upgrading the experience, which, given what Microsoft have done with other titles on the Series X and S, I think that that's a pretty likely thing. Continuing with the Xbox theme, Microsoft's Aaron Greenberg has said the following: "It's been a tremendous year so far, and it's going to be getting even better with the launch of Xbox Series X and Series S on November 10th. Across 4 generations and thousands of games playable this holiday, this will be the largest lineup in history of gaming." He also mentions that we will soon be seeing gameplay footage for Xbox Series X as well as S optimized games as we get closer and closer to launch. I'm honestly really looking forward to seeing what they actually have to offer. I mean, Microsoft furthermore have said that 10 Xbox game studios have launched in 2020. They've said the growing lineup and now into the future. And they've also, of course, mentioned those titles, what games they have been working on. Plus, they've also reaffirmed the fact that there will be a plethora of unannounced titles. At this point, given Microsoft does have so many studios, obviously, they've just brought ZeniMax into the fold, as we were just talking about, plus all of their other studios as well. I think that there's a really good chance that we're going to be seeing some really cool games out of Microsoft. I think that the narrative of Microsoft not having games is going to quickly start to fade away into the next year or two. And games, honestly, like Avowed, at least to me, look really cool. I'm actually really looking forward to trying out Avowed. I think that it's going to be very interesting to see how Microsoft respond and how the industry responds to Microsoft, given, of course, that now Microsoft are throwing so much money behind their titles. Yeah, I'll be interested to see how Sony actually responds to all of this, honestly. And now I want to discuss the Xbox Series X and the fact that there are multiple reports still that the console is getting rather toasty, but however, acoustically it is rather quiet. There have been a ton of these reports now starting to float around, including from a recent French stream, and he said, and I quote, "I don't know if I could talk about this, but we have the Series X, and it's hot, very hot, no noise, but it gives off heat. It's violent, I mean violent, yeah, it's violent, that's tons of violence, and you can even warm up thanks to the Series X. Clearly, from a sound point of view, it's good, but from a heat point of view, it's something." There have been other reports as well. I recently covered the ones from Giant Bomb, where Jeff Bakalar actually was mentioning the same thing. He even claims that the system was getting warm in standby with blowing exhaust air out. And again, there have been numerous statements about this. And I know I've covered this recently, but I feel that I kind of need to discuss it a bit more because people are still panicking about this. And what I'm trying to say is that I'm not saying that the consoles won't have issues, because at the end of the day, they have not come on store shelves yet, which is really what I like to judge things on. The final mass-produced units that you and I get, and I don't think it's going to be until several million of them are sold, and this is the same for the PlayStation, by the way, until we really know if there's issues with the console. But, with that said, when they're saying something like it's blowing out hot air, okay, what's the temperature of the air? Is the fan revving up? Well, clearly no, because they're saying it's quiet. Therefore, assuming there's nothing actually faulty with the system, or there's not a massive design issue, if it's not revving up, it means that the console's APU, which is actually what matters, it's not the temperature of the exhaust air, it's the temperature of the actual GPU. For example, if you're running any modern PC GPU, it literally doesn't matter if it's AMD, Nvidia, or from pretty much any generation, as long as it's like, you know, anything slightly modern, like even from 2010 or something like that. I'm going to give you a hint. It puts out heat. You know, a GPU from Nvidia's, like, you know, 20 series, 10 series, 30 series, it could hit 60, 70, 80 degrees, and that's fine. The clock frequency for the GPU on a PC will perhaps diminish a little bit if it goes over a certain threshold, just because of how Boost 3.0 works on NVIDIA cards, and same thing for AMD cards. But it's fine. It's literally supposed to do that. Hot air is being blown out, and it's operating at a temperature which is within the thermal constraints, within the thermal limits and tolerances of this design. So when they're saying something like hot air is blowing out, I don't care about that. What I care about is, well, first of all, what is the temperature of the air being blown out? And second of all, what is the temperature on the actual APU itself? Now, if we don't know that, it's very difficult to actually make any meaningful comparisons. Second problem I've got with this is, were the consoles in an optimum environment? Is there any blockages on any of the air vents? That type of thing. I'm not accusing these people. I'm just simply saying that because we don't have enough information, it's very difficult to make an assessment. Third issue. Is it because these consoles are not... or are they slightly different from the final manufactured console? Possibly. We don't know. It's also kind of brings me to the ridiculous thing of when people were saying that the PlayStation was overheating, and I had to do the same thing then. I really suggest that you check out the PlayStation 5 overheating video. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. But most of the same testing procedures that Sony would use, Microsoft would use. There are some small exceptions on their testing procedures and probably tolerances, but still, by and large, they will do the same thing. When a console is being bought up, in other words, they're testing the APU, they're testing the console itself, they will first of all test the APU to figure out what the tolerances are. How much voltage does it need? How much heat does it generate? What clock frequencies can we get? Yields, all of that crap. Okay, so when you've got that, and I am simplifying it, I've gone much more extensively into the stuff with the PlayStation video, then they will start to actually test it in a console-like form. Now, bear in mind that a console-like form will change over time, and they will test it repeatedly. And I don't just mean in ideal conditions, you know, with an air-conditioned apartment or something like that done. No, I'm talking extreme conditions. For example, it might be tested in essentially, I don't want to exactly say like an oven, like an easy bake oven, but yeah, something that's going to be putting out quite a lot of heat, to basically kind of simulate what it would be like if you're running this console in a really hot country with very little airflow. Because obviously they don't want a ton of returns. Again, this is not to say that there are not issues with the console. I'm just simply saying that when I think people are associating hot with overheating, and it's not the same thing. People really need to just chill on this stuff, no pun intended. This is not to say that I, as someone who's pre-ordered the consoles, both of them, I'm not interested to figure out what the temperatures are, but as long as it's within the tolerances of the silicon itself, and hint, it probably is, I don't think it actually matters. With this said, if, just for the sake of argument, if there were issues, and Microsoft were like, you know what? Actually, we think that it is possibly running just a little bit too toasty, they could probably just bump the fan speeds up via a BIOS update or a firmware update for the console. I'm not 100% on that because at the end of the day, I don't exactly know how the OS and fan controllers will function on an Xbox Series X because, well, I've not used one. And I obviously don't have access to Microsoft's proprietary BIOSes and all of that stuff. But it's not hard to kind of figure that they would be able to do that. So I don't think it's very difficult to imagine that if there are issues, then just cranking up the fan speeds like 10% or something like that is something that Microsoft could do, and they could obviously just push that out as a firmware update, sorry, as an OS update. Again, I'm not trying to say that this story is not interesting, But what I am saying is that people panicking about this is just ridiculous, and it really doesn't make any sense. Wait until the final console's released, then we can start to see if there are any issues. Moving on, the final story, and this one's kind of a positive note, which is why I'm leaving it until last. Randy Pitchford has actually been talking about the next generation consoles, and he believes that both consoles will be the biggest leap ever, and he's even including here 2D to 3D, which honestly is a pretty bold statement. This is with an interview with GameSpot, so I'll link the interview in the description. Randy says, and I quote, "I think customers will realise how profound of a difference it has to have the throughput capability of these new platforms. It's absolutely unreal. The leap there with the PS5 and Xbox Series X is the biggest leap I've ever seen in the history of console generations. I'm saying including the leap from 2D to 3D. It's going to change how we think about every one of our experiences. It's going to be hard to see that initial launch titles because of the launch games are just, well, endeavoured upon before. Frankly, there are a lot of ports, and the games have already been available to existing platforms that are being reimagined on those new platforms. Still, I'm super pumped what it means for Borderlands on the PS5 and Xbox Series X. We've expanded on it a lot," he's referring to Borderlands 3 here, "with increased resolutions, frame rates, and 4-player split screen. That's like rendering 4 copies of the game at once on a single console. It's freaking cool, man. I'm really excited for gamers to get this experience of Borderlands 3 on the next-gen consoles, and I think it's a really big moment," end quote. And I actually 110 million% agree with Randy. The fact of the matter is, people are judging these consoles based upon software, which is super duper early. And I have a lot of questions when people kind of are getting so mad about resolutions and all this stuff. Firstly, what are the states of the development kits which originally these games were being designed on? Was it like late PS4, Xbox, and then ported? If so, it's not really indicative of what the consoles are capable of achieving. What about the engines? How much time have the developers had to optimize the engines for the next generation consoles? Even things such as hardware-based ray tracing, there's a lot of ways that you can tweak, enhance, and optimize something like hardware-based ray tracing. So you can get basically the same level of visual effect most likely in a couple of years' time, but for much cheaper of a cost. So I completely agree with Randy that if a game, just for example, let's just take The Medium. If a game like The Medium was to launch, let's say, 3 years after the console debuted, rather than pretty much at launch, I can imagine that it would look so much better. And it doesn't look bad by any means now. It looks bloody amazing. And the same thing could be said, of course, for other games such as Demon's Souls and whatever else. At the end of the day, we are still really early in the console generation. The damn things have not been released yet. Development kits were kind of, well, in some cases behind schedule. I think it's way too early to have any kind of insight into how these consoles are going to perform over the long haul. But with all of that said, thank you very much for watching the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.